What's one of the best but little known Chilean wine regions that you need to try? How has Argentina's flagship red wine, Malbec, changed over the past 5 years in pretty surprising ways? And what type of wine do they make in other South American countries such as Uruguay, Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil? We're going to find out those stories and tips and much more from our guest tonight, whom shall introduce momentarily. But if you're watching this video on the replay, please, in the comments, type the word replay. I want to know, where are you logging in from? What's the weather like? What's in your glass? Anything you'd like to share. And of course, if you're here live on this live stream, please let me know where you're logging in from. I'm Natalie McLean, and I teach online wine and food pairing courses, and you've just joined one of the most passionate group of wine lovers who gather every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern to talk to the most interesting people in the world of wine. Now, this is a live stream, but it is based on a recording that we made for my podcast, Unreserved Wine Talk, so that you can listen that way or here. It's your choice. But I want to hear from you while we're doing this, because I will be live in the comments with you. What's your opinion of what we're discussing? What stories and tips do you value most? What questions do you still have? So get in there in the comments and let us know. All right, back to our guest. Amanda Barnes is an award-winning wine and travel writer and the author of a gorgeous book, The South American Wine Guide. Although she was born and raised in Hampshire, England, Amanda has been based in South America since 2009, specializing in the wines of Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Bolivia, Peru, and Brazil. Her writing has been published in Decanter magazine and the World Atlas of Wine, and she is the editor of the Circle of Wine Writers monthly publication. She joins us now from her home in Mendoza. Hello, Amanda. So glad you're joining us.
Hello, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you, virtually, but with you.
Yes, virtually. That's the best we can do most days these
Yeah.
days. Anyway, so before we dive into your wine career, do you recall the moment you realized that you wanted to become a writer?
It's difficult to kind of align it to a moment. I think I was quite an avid reader as a young child. So I would read a lot of, different novels and fiction. And I think it was just kind of piece by piece, the threads kind of came together. And I thought, at one stage I was going to be a vet, like everyone work in a zoo, I wanted to be an actress, as any kind of slightly annoying young child does want to be. And then I really started to think, actually, maybe I like writing. And actually, it was when I was going to go to drama school for university that my drama teacher said that he was going to give my recommendation for RADA, because he can only give one or two a year. And he said he was going to give me the recommendation, but that he really thinks I should think about studying writing first.
Huh.
And that,
So,
I think, was probably the advice that actually made me go, maybe I will take literature and then I can do acting if I want to later. And then I really got into the flow of writing and journalism. And I started writing for newspapers when I was 15. So
oh, wow.
it was always something I did. And I did a lot of poetry as a child and had to read it in front of assembly and had lots of cringeworthy moments.
What were
reading,
you writing
reading,
about? What were you writing
love,
about at
always
15?
love.
Love. Oh,
Well,
love.
no,
Okay.
as a journalist, I was working on the local newspapers. So everything, from covering the local fate to, police reports or sitting in at council
Wow.
meetings. But yeah, my poetry was almost always about romance.
Oh, yes. Yes. Well, as it should be. And then you became enamored of South American authors such as Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude, I believe.
Mm.
Did those writers inspire you to travel to South America?
Definitely.
Yeah.
So when I was at university in London, I was studying comparative literature. So the first year they actually offered it as a bachelor's, and I did as part of my entire course. I took Latin American literature and absolutely fell head over heels with magical realism, the genre that is quite prolific here, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez as one, Borges another. Did my thesis on it in the end, and just fell in love with the literature and with all the kind of stories that they wove together. I mean, magical realism is actually quite dark, but there was so much fantasy in there as well, which just really, appealed to my sense of adventure, and I'd been kind of consuming South America from afar for a long time in terms of music and my friends, Latin American friends, learning Spanish with them, and so yeah, it was definitely literature and that kind of inspired my big leap to South America, along with other kind of cultural influences.
And now you've added wine to that consumption. So
Yeah.
you ended up moving from England to Argentina. That's a long way to journey away from family and home. What inspired you to actually move and live in Argentina?
Well, I didn't. I just wanted to go, and I thought, I'd been at that stage. I'd been working at a newspaper. I was editor of the local newspaper for a couple of years. I wasn't learning anything new, and we were in one of those moments of kind of crises in the press. Well, in the economy, but it also was impacting press. And I decided that actually, if I'm going to make this jump, I may as well do it now while I was young and didn't have to worry about things like mortgage or anything else, and decided to go live for a year, test it out, and if I wasn't happy, come back. And I was happy. I
There you
loved
go.
it, and I fell down the rabbit hole that is the wine industry, and originally I wasn't planning to come here to write about wine. I was going to write about gastronomy and travel, and I thought I had to learn about wine in order to be a better food writer, a better gastronomy writer. And then I started to discover that wine has everything: food, travel, but also history, geology, people. When you write about wine, you're writing about stories and families and places, and that's what I absolutely love, looking at the world through the lens of wine.
I love that. I find that is what draws me to wine and wine writing in particular.
Mm.
It just it gives you a view into the world and an excuse to get into people's lives and homes. Um,
Yeah.
so, what inspired you to write the South American Wine Guide? So you're obviously captured by the land and the people, but what sort of moved the dial for you to actually produce a book, and especially such a big book, beautiful book?
Well, I moved here in 2009, and there really weren't many. There aren't many books about South American wine, not even in Spanish or Portuguese. Actually, it's quite limited, the coverage relatively, if you compare it to other wine producing countries of the size and dimension. I mean, Chile and Argentina are both, within the top 10 of the world producing countries, wine producing countries in the world. So, I spent 10 years really kind of figuring it all out by myself in many ways, catching the bus here, there, and everywhere, and trying to figure out how to get to these far-flung areas and what the wine was all about. And it was through conversations, it was through meeting people, but it was very much, grassroots, the whole experience of being here for those first 10 years. Now, South America has changed a lot in 10 years. So anyone that's coming here today will have a very different experience to what I did in 2009 or 2010. But I think, a lot of people started asking me. I was always writing for other magazines and websites, and I had my own website, which I started, I think, in 2012, which was a winery guide and just somewhere where I could upload some of my, experiences more as a blog. And I was writing for other books, and people started to say, "Why? When is your book coming out?" And I was like, "Ah, ha ha ha, no, it's too much work." And then I was like, "Actually, why don't I write a book and give a platform for all these incredible places that just don't have much of a voice?" Everyone writes a lot about Mendoza, which is where I live in Argentina. People write a fair amount about Maipo in Chile, but there's lots of regions in Argentina and Chile that don't really get any coverage. And then there's other countries, Uruguay, Peru, Bolivia, Brazil, which are really underserved in terms of international writers covering these regions. And the wines aren't quite as relevant commercially, but it's still very interesting. And I think it's part of the fascinating story of South American wine. And so I really wanted to write the book as an opportunity for producers of South America to have a bigger window to kind of show themselves to the world, and for people to get engaged in South American wine and be able to have that basis to learn about the wine regions and have the confidence to try wines beyond their usual comfort zone. And I really think, the reason that Burgundy and great wine regions of Europe are so well known today is not only because the wines are great, but it's that accessibility of knowledge. It's very easy to find out information about the different crews and the different producers. And I think, my goal with the book is to make South America more accessible so that people, can dive in with more confidence and discover the incredible wines, regions, and people that, that come from this beautiful and fascinating continent.
Wow. Cool. So you've kind of answered one of the other questions I had in a nutshell. What is this book about? But if you were to give an elevator pitch, or something that you haven't mentioned, now there are lots of maps, for instance. How many maps are there?
Oh gosh, I think there's over 50. I can't remember, but it's been that was a lot of work. So the
I
book
bet.
the book has several kind of sections. There's more the traditional, getting to know the grape varieties. There's the getting to know the wineries. But the main focus of the book is very much on terroir. So I really want to let people know what makes, because, we can talk about Argentina in general, and we can talk about Mendoza, but actually it's not, Mendoza's far too big. You've got a world of wine within Mendoza. So my goal with the book is really to kind of dial down on those individual, crews, if you like, and be able to kind of explain what the difference is between somewhere like, Guaymallén in the east of Mendoza versus somewhere like San Carlos in the very south of the Yucca Valley, and really be able to kind of make those comparisons of terroir and go in and talk about the regional expression of the wines, but also the experience of being there. And how they feel different, how they look different, how the culture's different, how the landscapes are different, how the food is different, all those kind of, that travel wine experience, which I think we also get through the glass. And so there's a lot of kind of focus on terroir. And then I have travel tips, how to get around to these regions, where to stay, as well as terroir kind of selections, wine recommendations for each region. If you really want to know Alto Maipo, these are the wines that I really recommend you try. I don't do points. I think that's very subjective. Instead, it's more a guidance, a curation of the wines that I've tried and tested, often several times,
That's great.
and really kind of, this is, if you want to get to grips with this region, try these, and then discover your own later as well.
And do you happen to have that book close by?
I do. It's right
Oh,
here.
there. How convenient. Hold it. It's beautiful. And for those who are listening to the podcast, we will put a link to it in the show notes because you sell it directly. But how much does that book weigh, Amanda?
Oh gosh. So it's a solid, so it's 1.5 kilos, but my first print run was 2 kilos. And
What
so
is
I
that in
actually,
pounds, I wonder?
oh,
I'm
I'm not
not
very
good
good
at
at that, but
exchange. Probably
it's
5 pounds.
definitely, yeah, a very big, heavy bottle of wine, more than a big, heavy bottle of wine. But I actually, for this second print, it's got more pages, but I lowered the paperweight. So you've
Okay.
actually, in the second print, there's actually more information, more wines, but lighter paperweight. It's still beautiful paper though.
It,
I fell in love
it
with the
is.
print process. That's the amazing thing about publishing yourself, is
Yes.
it's really hard work. I'm not, I don't take it lightly. It takes a lot of effort and hair pulling and stress. I think I've shed 5 years from my lifespan doing it, but it is a beautiful experience, and just picking the paper and really dialing in on those kind of little details, like, your ribbon bands, like things like this. I'll show you.
Ah,
So here, like,
gorgeous.
picking your
Yes.
little ribbon band and the different
Yes.
kind of ribbons that you go with. So
And even
it's
the
really,
color
it's
at the
lovely.
end of the pages, the whatever that is.
Yeah, this is my gilt
Typical.
edge. So I
Oh, the
call it,
gilt
it's a
edge.
gilt edge. So I call this
Okay.
my Malbec colored edge. But then when I'm in
Yes.
Chile, I have to say Carmenere colored edge.
Oh, yes, of
And when
course.
I'm in
Right.
Uruguay, it's my Tanat colored edge.
Of course.
Truthfully, it's my my Malbec colored edge. Here are the ribbons I discussed.
And is the book available? It is directly available from you. Can people buy it, say, on other online retailers, or it's
Yeah,
your
so
site only?
Academy Divan are doing the distribution, so you can get it from their website, in
Okay.
Canada actually as well. And
Okay.
then also it's on the beast that is Amazon too.
Yes.
Although it's
Um,
cheaper to get it direct.
right. Well, that's good. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that is a lot of work. Did you why did you choose to self-publish? Was it because it was such a massive book that traditional mainstream publishers wouldn't take a chance on that cost investment, or was it just you wanted to control the entire process?
Both. So I
Okay.
did speak to a couple publishers before and had two offers, but they would take complete intellectual property. The payment was also, frankly, rubbish for the amount of time I was going to spend, in investing 2 years in producing this book. The financial reward was nothing. But I have to be honest, the financial reward in self-publishing is worse. So that's not the motivation. But that's that was part of another reason not to go with the traditional publishers. And then also the space they just didn't want to let me have. I've got over 500 pages in this book, and I think in every discussion it was getting it down to less than 200,
Wow.
and often the conversation about not covering Uruguay or Peru or Bolivia, only Argentina and Chile. And I just felt that was doing a complete disservice to South America, and also, to what I'd invested the last decade of my life in. And so I really wanted to have that complete creative control, intellectual property. And, it's not for the faint-hearted. I had to
No.
learn everything. And that's the whole reason this is by Amanda Barnes and Amigos, is
Ah.
because I not only relied on the help of friends, amigos, to give me information about regions, to spend time with me in vineyards and walking the dirt and tasting wines together, but also a lot of friends helped me, guided me through that wine writing, publishing process. So other self-published authors like Simon Wolf, Wink Lorch, both gave me like really good advice, how to kind of get started, and then, other friends completely outside of the wine sector as well. Catherine Roach, who's a good friend of mine, was just my knight in shining armor when it came to the last kind of section of getting through the print and making sure that all the proofs were kind of down to an art. So there were a lot of friends involved. My friend Helen in Chile, who read through every single word twice, three times to proof it. There were a lot of friends, all the photographers that contributed. There were a lot of friends that really helped me put this together. I couldn't have done it without the help. I couldn't have afforded it without the help of friends. But
Valued
it's a
friends indeed.
difficult
Wow.
process, but a beautiful one.
Yeah.
It's a once in a lifetime experience.
It's a legacy for sure.
Mm.
There is that deep satisfaction of having produced something physical that and a beautiful artifact. It is a tribute. So, well done.
Mm.
Um,
Thank you.
so yes, absolutely. So let's talk about the evolution of Argentina's flagship red wine, Malbec. How and when did it arrive in Argentina?
So Argentina and South America in general have these kind of two history lines, which is quite interesting. The first one is what I kind of call the Criolla period, which is when those first vines arrived in the 1500s, or actually the late 1400s, if we're going to be precise. But started kind of proliferating in the 1500s, and these were the vines that were brought by Christopher Columbus and the conquistadores, and then stayed with the Spanish immigrants mainly and the Jesuits as they were maybe making their way around the continent. And those first vines were largely, there were two that were the most important: Listan Prieto and Moscatelli Alejandría. And from these, it's very interesting because from those two varieties, we actually had this entire family of South American wines born, native varieties, which we call, some of us call the Criolla varieties. There's lots of different names. But in my book, I have an early kind of family tree, a simplistic family tree, for all these native varieties that came from those original ones. So we have, one of the most famous is Torrontés, which you get in Argentina today. But then, you also have Listan Prieto, the original one, makes fascinating wines called País in Chile, and Criolla Chica in Argentina, and lots of different regions. Those varieties were the only varieties here until the 1800s. And then in the 1850s, we had this other second kind of era, I would say, of South American wine, where we had the Bordeaux influence largely, and the European influence again, but mainly kind of more French, in terms of kind of intellectual influence. And then we also had these huge waves of Italian immigrants, and Spanish as well, but noticeably Italian, which were really important, especially to the development of the industry in Argentina and Brazil. And, you know, Chile to a lesser extent. Chile was further, it was harder to get around to Chile on the boat. So I think you got the really hardy immigrants, you got a lot more kind of Germans and, you know, those kind of Northern Europeans that are used to those kind of treacherous cold conditions. Whereas like the Italians kind of stuck to the first, the first area that they could get to, which was Argentina and largely Brazil as well. And so in that immigrant wave and also that intellectual exchange with Bordeaux, that's when Malbec arrived, along with a massive kind of treasure trove of lots of different European varieties. And it's very serendipitous as when they arrived because it was just before phylloxera started, you know, before phylloxera came to Europe. So South
Wiped
America
out all the vineyards,
received.
for those who may not have heard about it, but the root
Yeah,
lettuce
sorry,
was
yeah,
devastated.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And so they
perfect. So
brought these
phylloxera that
cousins.
wiped out all these vineyards, and just before that, we get Malbec, we get Carmenere, which after phylloxera we thought was completely extinct. We didn't think there was any left after phylloxera, and then it got rediscovered because it had been planted in Chile this whole time. And so we have this huge diversity of grape varieties that came in the 1800s. And when you add that to the diversity of native Criollo varieties, there's a lot to discover here. And even though we have trends, and Malbec is one of those big trends, which have largely kind of taken over the population of vines in different periods, that diversity still remains in the old vines. So we still find really old vines of Chasselas from Switzerland, for example, for the Swiss immigrants, especially in Chile. You know, we find Bequignol, which is practically not planted anywhere else, mainly here in Argentina. So there's lots of kind of those relics of the 1800s, which have been kept in production by some producers. But yeah, the beautiful story of Malbec is that it came in the 1800s, was planted quite widely. It actually thrived here. It did very well. It didn't do so well in Bordeaux, which is where it was, you know, previously in Saint-Emilion, they actually think there was more Malbec planted than Merlot. But before phylloxera, before this big disease wiped out all the vineyards. Anyway, it didn't do so well in Bordeaux because it doesn't set very well. It needs sunny, dry conditions for the fruit to set and give you a nice kind of homogeneous production. And here in Mendoza, we have dry, sunny conditions. And so it actually works really well. And throughout kind of Argentina's Andean corridor. But it was only known as the Cepa Francesa, and it wasn't very valuable until the kind of market rediscovered it in the 2000s.
Okay. And it didn't do well either, or wasn't taken to Chile, I assume. Like the conditions were not ideal there?
No, it was in Chile first. So
Oh, it was in Chile first. Okay.
yeah, so all of those Bordeaux varieties that came to Argentina in the 1850s actually came to Chile first. And
Okay.
I don't know, I mean, Argentina is very slightly more persuasive, I think, even in the 1800s than the Chileans. And actually, they kind of stole the main ampelographer that was working in Chile at the time. And
Kidnapped him
one of
at
the
night.
presidents, yeah, like managed to persuade him to come over to Argentina and start the viticulture foundation here. So that's what happened. So he moved over here a couple of years later and then basically did the same as what he'd already been doing in Chile. So there are actually older vines of Malbec in Chile than there are Argentina, in the very far south.
But we don't
There's
hear about them. I guess they didn't really spread or thrive. I mean, I just don't hear about Chilean Malbec
Yes,
much.
there isn't as much. There isn't as much. They didn't spread to the same extent. So Chile was still very much, it was País. It was the very hardy kind of Criollo variety that was really the one that did very well. And then Chile kind of, you know, started pushing Cabernet Sauvignon and lots of different grape varieties. So Cabernet Sauvignon is the champion of Chile. Malbec is the champion of Argentina. But it went out of fashion. So in the kind of 80s, so in the 70s, there was a period of which everyone was drinking a lot of wine, 92 litres per capita. And actually, those lower producing, lower yielding varieties like Malbec, they weren't very popular because you couldn't keep up with that demand. So they were ripped out, and more of those old Criollo varieties were replanted because they are higher yielding. And then in the 90s, everyone, you know, some kind of pioneers decided they wanted to make high quality wines to export. And actually, it was Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay that, you know, Nicolas Catena, like all the kind of families were really looking at originally. to bring Argentina to the world class level. And it wasn't, it was, it was several kind of winemakers all at the same time actually thought, well, why don't we look at this cepa francesa, this old, these old vines of Malbec, which actually give us a very similar quality to Cabernet Sauvignon. We get deep color, we get lovely fruit profile, it's got nice acidity. Like, why don't we use that? Why are we working so hard to make Cabernet Sauvignon? What's wrong with our Malbec? And so there were several pioneers. Nicolas Catena was one of them, Attilio Pagli, another, the Italian winemakers, Alberto Antonini, who really, focused in on the potential of Malbec and started making single variety Malbec, taking it to the US, actually. It was the US that really kind of paid attention. And then when the critics kind of came back saying, well, this is really interesting, it's really nice, that's when, the Argentinians themselves started having confidence in that variety again, and just then it went off like wildfire and became once again the kind of champion of Argentina after basically being completely ripped out in the 90s. But there were about 10,000 hectares or so that survived the kind of big vine pull. And so we do have some incredible old vines of Malbec as well, vines that are over 100 years old and just have this incredible depth and richness to them.
Wow. And so, I mean, the style I remember from Malbec when it was kind of at zenith, at least in Canada and perhaps in the US, was big and bold and fruity like the Australian Shirazes were at the time. What's changed over the last, say, 5 to 10 years in terms of the style of Malbec?
I'd say that a lot of producers have moved away from that style. And I don't think it's just Malbec. I think that big, bold, rich, fruity, quite oaky style was very much a trend in the 2000s. It was that kind of Robert Parker, kind of pushed trend where people were seeking that ripeness and that, that high ABV and that kind of sweet oak.
ABV? Sorry, what is that?
High ABV, high alcohol.
Oh,
sorry.
ABV, right. Alcohol by volume. Mm-hmm.
So, I think that was a trend in the 2000s, and Malbec was definitely a victim to that trend. But I think what's been really beautiful in the last kind of 10 years or so is actually seeing winemakers have more confidence not to follow the trends anymore. I mean, we could argue that there is a trend in the other direction, but I think it's more about the producers here saying, well, actually, let's look at what Malbec has in its own, by itself. And there's really been a focus on, picking slightly earlier, maintaining that nice acidity that Malbec does have when you pick early enough. Enjoying those kind of tannins that Malbec has, those fine graphite-y tannins that Malbec has, without, when you don't over ripen it and make it kind of soft and plummy and rich, and really kind of dialing down on the oak, being very sensitive to it, and only using it as a way to kind of balance it out. I think some of the best Malbecs today are more made in the style of a Pinot Noir than they are made in the style of Cabernet Sauvignon. And even though it has a lot more colour than most, Pinots or lighter bodied varieties would, it can have that real freshness, that real brightness, that real approachability, but with not really approachability, because I'm not talking about juicy, easy drinking Pinots. I'm talking about proper serious Burgundy. So it can have those kind of like fine tannins that serious Burgundy has, while having that nice kind of elegance and balance. And I think that's the way that the top kind of winemakers here are really kind of, looking and showing. And it's also the only way in which I think you really can show particularities of terroir in different regions, because you're not covering it with oak or sugar.
Right, that's true. I like the expression graphite tannins. Okay, I think you mean fine tannins, but why do you pick the words graphite tannins? What does that mean to you?
For me, when you like suck on it's probably, I shouldn't admit this, but when you like suck on pencil lead or that kind of experience of more those kind of like fine kind of mineral tannins that aren't blocky and intense, but they're solid, but they're very fine grained.
Right.
That's what I mean by kind of graphite tannins.
Homework
I probably
assignment.
should stop sucking on pencils and
That's That's okay. You do it to be thorough with your research. That's fine. You've given a lot.
Well, I have. When I've been with winemakers and talking a lot in Argentina, the obsession here and in Chile is going into the soil pits. So digging a big hole in the ground and going in and looking at the kind of soil types and deciding how that has impacted the wine. And many of the winemakers will often talk about the influence. We've got some subregions here which have a high percentage of chalk, of limestone. And so they'll talk about the chalky tannins. And so I do, when I'm there with winemakers, we do lick the chalk, we do lick the rocks just to make sure that, we do actually believe in what we say, that we describe it as chalky tannins.
Sure, absolutely. And so, I mean, this is an ongoing debate in the wine world, but do you think, so different types of soil create different types of styles of wine, whether it's Malbec or something else, but is it just a drainage factor? Because we know, I think, that plants are organic. They can't really take minerals and translate them into the wine, digest them. But what do you think is going on there?
I do. I think it's massively a drainage, and I'm sure there are differences to nutrient uptake as well. In a country like, in countries like Chile and Argentina, drainage is really important. Because, you are actually, you're mainly irrigating as well. So you really need free draining so the roots go deep, but you also want some kind of water retention. And those kind of chalkier limestone soils are very good at that water, holding on to a good amount of water retention. I don't know the science behind it. I've had the conversation a lot with many different people. I've read a lot of books about it. I don't know that we can definitively say that this soil gives you this flavor profile, but I can say from experience that sandy soils give you lots of fruit. Typically you have very kind of like a very fruity but less kind of structured wine. Those chalky soils typically give you really nice acidity. And then when you get to some of the more kind of volcanic soils of granite, like I always find a real blood, like iron note coming through in the wine. So I do think anecdotally, and through experience and through tasting, we can definitely see differences, and blind as well. So, it's one thing to be looking at a label and tasting it and knowing where it comes from. But if you taste blind as well, I do think, not always, but I do think you can certainly notice the difference. I've tested some winemakers here. One of my good friends, Leo Arasso, who makes wines in Chile, he used to be making wine here in Argentina, in Altos Los Hormigas, and he's a real soil geek. He's done, so many studies into terroir and, his PhD and all the rest. And I brought a handful of wines, like 5 Malbecs from different vineyards, different soils, blind, unlabeled bottles. And I was like, go on then, put your money where your mouth is, tell me the soil. And he nailed it. He got 4 out of 5 correct, spot on. Yeah, so I think we need to go further in figuring out the exact correlation and why. But I definitely think there is a correlation for sure.
Right. And do sandy soils hold on to more moisture than the chalk soils?
Less.
Less. Okay, so they're giving you fruitier wines with less, they're retaining less moisture. Okay, interesting. I'm trying to keep it straight in my own head as to, like, okay, this does that, and okay. So what percentage of vineyards today are planted with Malbec in the country?
Well, Malbec is one of the most, I'd have to look at my book to give you the actual percentage, but Malbec is one of the most planted varieties in Argentina. I think it's a good, let me have a look. I don't want to say anything that's incorrect, but it is number 1 by a long way. So we'd have to work out the actual percentage. So we have over 45,000 hectares of Malbec. Do you work in hectares or acres?
Either or.
And then I think we have 200 or so. I mean, I think it's at least a quarter.
Okay.
So significant.
Significant.
It's very high. Or maybe it's more like a fifth actually. But it's very, Malbec is the champion grape, and it's a great opportunity to visit all the different wine regions through one wine. In almost every wine region, Malbec is planted in Argentina. So it's a real unparalleled, it's an unparalleled opportunity to taste different terroirs. That's what I love about Malbec.
And how does it express itself at various elevations in the Andes? What happens to Malbec as it goes up the hill?
Yeah, so the important thing about elevation if we're looking at Mendoza, for example, um, you get cooler, well, you get higher, typically you get cooler as you go up in altitude, but you also get greater diurnal range. So you might have actually, it might be slightly warmer during the day, depending on where you are and the exposure and lots of other things. So it's very hard to just generalize. There's a lot of old
Sure.
books that say for every 100 meters you go cooler by a degree or just less Celsius, but that's not true when you look at the actual intricacies of different valleys and shapes and soils. But typically it gets cooler as you go higher in altitude. But the most important thing is that you get those cooler nights, and you get that real kind of break for the grapes to respire and to have that cooler weather in the evening, and then you often get quite high solar exposure during the day, and quite kind of intense sunny conditions during the day. So that means that you get great ripeness, but you maintain that beautiful acidity. And that's really important. So if we're in like lower altitude regions towards the east of Mendoza, for example, which might be 600, 700, 800 meters, there you'll typically get very kind of rich, ripe fruit. It can be kind of slightly jammy in style as well, but less of that kind of acidity, less of that kind of tannin. The fruit will normally be slightly more on the kind of red, ripe spectrum. Whereas as you start to move higher in altitude, towards the Yuko Valley, you'll typically get kind of fresher wines with floral notes, maybe like fresh black fruits, and then also higher acidity. And also they could be a bit more tannic depending very much on the region as well and the soil structure and all the rest. But that's the kind of general term. Although, there are always caveats, so
Sure,
it's hard to
absolutely.
generalize.
But as you go up too, you talked about solar radiation because you're getting closer to the sun, literally.
Yeah.
So it's not just sunshine hours or whatever higher temperatures, it's actual solar radiation too
Yeah.
that helps with ripening of the grape skins and so on.
It does. And if you look, especially in Chile, for example, you get like there's much more solar radiation than in Argentina, and so you get real intensity of fruit. Um, Really kind of notable. Like I think Chilean wine is one of the easiest to blind taste and spot from anywhere in the world, Chile and Australia, in that intensity of fruit, that real brightness of fruit that you get. And that can be related to lots of different things beyond altitude as well. I mean, the ozone and different things too. So it's quite, it is very interesting, but there are lots of different climatic factors at play. But yeah, I mean, Torontes is another good example because if you compare the Torontes in typically in Salta, which is much higher altitude than here in Mendoza, you get really kind of fine floral notes, you get nice brighter acidity, whereas in those kind of lower, more traditional areas of Mendoza and San Juan, where Torontes were planted, they tend to be a bit kind of fuller bodied, richer, less acidity, and more kind of citrusy fruit rather than the very floral top notes that you get in the higher altitudes of Cafayate and Salta.
Yeah, and Torontes, I love the way you pronounce things. It's so much better because you're a native Spanish speaker, right?
Well, not native because
Not native,
I'm from
sorry,
yeah.
bilingual.
I speak so I've been here long enough that I can defend myself.
That's always important. Torontes is the sort of flagship white wine of Argentina, the one it's best known for, and it's a beautiful floral expression of a grape. Was it originally a cross of three different Spanish grapes?
No, so this is one of the ones that is the child of those two varieties that I mentioned, the first that came to South America, so Listan Prieto and Moscatelli Alejandría.
Okay,
The
and yeah,
three that you're talking about is there are three varieties of Torontes. So
ah,
we have
okay,
Torontes Riojano, which is the most planted and the highest quality, and that is a direct descendant of them too. It's a cross of them both. And native, it's kind of happened naturally in the vineyards. And then we've got San Juanino, which is the same, but every time a grape crosses, you have a different child. It's like, parents and children. And so again, it's a Torontes, but it's a different variety. We call it Torontes San Juanino. And then we've got Torrontés Mendocino, which we actually don't know who one of the parents was. So it's a completely different ball game, but has similar expressions. But the one that you're most likely to be drinking is Riojano. And the
Okay.
names are related to where they were discovered. Rioja in Argentina, San Juan in Argentina, and Mendoza in Argentina, but they're not related to necessarily where they're grown today. So Riojano is grown all over Argentina, and most of the wines in Salta and Cafayate are Riojano. So yeah, it's a more complex topic than probably most people want to be listening to at this while drinking wine. But
For
in my
sure.
book, I do detail I do
Yes.
detail the differences between them, and it's an ongoing kind of study here to figure out those differences and how to where they're best suited and how to vinify them best.
And of course, because you're in the southern hemisphere, as you go south, it gets colder. Because
Yeah.
up north in their country, it's closer to the equator. So Torrontés, you were mentioning Salta, which is more in the south end of
North.
the country. North. It's
Mm.
north? Okay. I'm completely confusing everybody.
Salta. Salta is the one that's right up in the north in Cafayate. Um,
Okay.
one of the northernmost ones.
And where's Patagonia in relation
In
to
the
that?
south.
In the south. Okay. So do
Far
they
in the south.
far in the south? So do they also grow Torrontés in Patagonia?
Yes, but they're more
Okay.
interested. Yes, they do. I mean, Torrontés can grow anywhere really, but they're more interested in cooler climate varieties like Chardonnay,
Okay.
Riesling, Gewürztraminer
Okay.
in
Okay.
the south and Patagonia. But Patagonia is very big as well, so it's difficult to, you've got traditional regions like Rio Negro, Neuquén, which are the beginning of Patagonia, and there
Hmm.
you can ripen Cabernet Sauvignon. It's not that cold. And then we've got the new emerging Patagonia, which is much further south, which is Chubut. And that's where I think some people have Merlot planted, some people have Malbec planted, but typically it's more Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Gewürztraminer, earlier ripening, cooler climate varieties.
Okay. And what do you like to pair with Torrontés? Like, do you have some favorite food pairings?
Yeah, I mean, a great. Torrontés is the first wine when I got here as kind of on a backpacker budget. It was the first wine that I really was always convinced that you could buy it for very little, and it was easy to drink and very nice, and it was a solid kind of white wine to drink chilled and like have by the swimming pool or with friends just by itself. Um, there was slightly more serious Torrontés that there are now, which are much more kind of elegant and focused and fresh. I think those are beautiful wines for kind of Asian cuisine or sushi or those aromatic grape varieties like Gewürztraminer. Um, or muscats. They're always nice with something that's quite kind of aromatic and has lots of kind of flavors of its own, and they work quite nicely with slightly spicier foods, which can be hard to pair with other wines. So I like Torrontés for that kind of cuisine. But it's actually quite as long as you don't have it can overwhelm a very simple dish. So that's the challenge with Torrontés. You've got a highly aromatic grape variety, so you need to make sure that your dish is equally as aromatic and flavorful. And then also it's quite light bodied, so you don't want anything, you don't want to go down the road of heavy meats or anything like that, or kind of cream or anything. This is quite a kind of delicate, lighter bodied grape. So those are my recommendations, kind of
Sounds
Asian
good.
cuisine, and definitely kind of sushi, and still by the swimming pool.
Absolutely. And favorite food pairings for Malbec? Maybe an unusual one as well?
Well, it depends on the type of Malbec, because you've got all those different kind of ranges of styles. Oh, but there's nothing, I mean, there's nothing better than a classic steak with Malbec.
Mm.
That unusual for Malbec. I mean, some of the really nice kind of lighter, more fine kind of bodied and focused, precise, linear, less oak expressions, I think you can treat like you would some Italian wines. And so, I quite like, if I'm making a nice pasta dish or anything, even if it's a kind of white based sauce, like I would still consider Malbec for those pairings. Because it doesn't, those kind of modern contemporary styles of Malbec, they don't require the fat or the kind of, grilled flavors in order to pair with them. They're much more delicate. They're much more kind of focused on spice and fruit,
Sure.
and nice acidity. So they're a lot more versatile in pairings.
Speaking of fat and grill, of course, the traditional Argentine method, you've called it a fire cooking culture, the asado, the outdoor barbecue or grill. Um, what? Let's talk about the empanadas that are often part of that, an early part of the meal. What?
Mm.
Why are they so iconic as in the meal?
I think one time, I think many years ago, I was writing an article about the humble empanada and actually looking at the world variations. I think every culture has their version of an empanada. Like in England, we have the pasty. Like in India, they have the samosa. Everyone's got their kind of their empanada. But here in South America, you know, Brazil has pastéis. In Chile and Argentina, it's both the empanada, the same as in Uruguay. But everyone has their version of empanada.
A pastry,
And
essentially, right?
yeah, a pastry stuffed with something, a pie. And so in Argentina, it changes as well. The meat empanada is the classic,
Hmm.
but it also the recipe changes depending on where you are. So if you're in the north in Salta, it will typically have more spices. It will have a little bit of ají, a little bit of chili pepper in there, and raisins if you're more kind of towards the east, that kind of sweetness. They might add some sugar in Cordoba where they have real sweet tooth. And then further in Mendoza, the typical empanada has about 50% onion. So it's quite
Oh,
high on the onion quantity and potato. And it's all, everyone, there can be differences in terms of whether you're adding olive or a hard-boiled egg or, your balance of onion and all the rest. So I think it's just become, it's the symbol of each region is their particular empanada style. And they're just, perfect little morsels to have either during the day for like a lunch or, the way that you start and open up your evening of asado and it's the first thing that comes out of the grill and normally in like it has to be in a kind of clay oven style grill
hmm,
and you put it in you cook them before you start with the meat and all the rest and yeah they're just delicious and the pairing varies as well so in the north they will pair Torontes and here in Mendoza it will always be Malbec so they're just lovely kind of regional expressions of different places and their favorite kind of pairings, and they're
yeah.
delicious.
I've heard lard or fat is the key to a great empanada.
It is, yeah, it is. I have a recipe in my book actually, which is from
Ah,
a really great chef here in Mendoza, and yeah, some people might get a little bit worried about the quantity of lard, but but it's good. It's all collagen, it's fine. But it's, yeah, lard is the typical. You can switch that out for olive oil, which is fine. It doesn't have the same kind of lovely flakiness to it, or taste, but olive oil is a suitable alternative for a healthier lifestyle.
okay. Um, So Argentina also produces more Fernet, a bitter aromatic spirit, more so than Italy, where it was first created. What's in this drink, and why is Argentina so enthusiastic about it?
Yeah, Fernet is definitely one of the most consumed drinks here in Argentina. So it's a bitter, it's a typical Italian bitter, kind of aperitif. It's about 40%. And it is, it came from the Italian immigrants when they all came here. They, brought their traditions of these bitters as well. They
It's
drink
forty
a fair
percent
amount.
alcohol.
Yeah,
So yeah, oh,
yeah,
whiskey
40%
style, rookie
alcohol.
left. Yeah,
Exactly. So
yeah.
in Italy, they would drink it as an aperitif or a digestif. So before or after a meal by itself. Um, in Argentina, it's a slightly different way that they consume it. They consume it with Coca-Cola, so Fernet y
Oh,
Cola. So it's always blended with Coca-Cola, and people will drink it. The funniest thing is when you go to barbecue in the mountains, and they will just cut through the Coca-Cola bottle, take off the kind of top, and have the entire liter of Coke filled with
oh,
ice and Fernet.
oh my
And
gosh.
when I first got here, I was like, okay, well, if this is what everyone's drinking, sure, I'll give it a go. But actually, you do realize if you drink too much, a lot of Fernet in one night, you realize that it is a digestif. You do not want to be drinking it by the liter, or at least you know, a sensitive English stomach does not enjoy drinking it by the litre. So I don't actually drink Fernet anymore because I find it it's intense, and I don't like Coca-Cola either.
Oh,
So
yeah.
so yeah,
What
but
makes it a
it is the bar
digestive?
drink.
What is
And
it
there's
about
all the
bitters that makes them?
yeah, all the
Yeah.
bitters. I mean, they were used as medicine before, weren't they?
Okay. Yeah.
It. I mean, I again, I'm not sure exactly why the bitters or arrowroot and things like that, why they kind of have that um, digestive property,
Hmm.
but they do.
Yeah, yeah.
But
But
yeah,
they
the
do
Fernet's a
still
big deal here. I
are
think they drink
cautious.
more than Italy.
All right.
I think they
Okay.
drink far more of Fernet. But the other thing that's coming back in fashion here, which has always been kind of popular, is vermouth. And again, from that kind of Italian and Spanish ancestry, the immigrant ancestry that we have here. And that's been really nice. Like during the pandemic, a lot of winemakers, they were stuck inside. They weren't traveling. They weren't doing all the extra things that they normally do on top of their, job making wine. And so a lot of them kind of turned their hand to making interesting vermouths and gins and different things from a base of wine. And so we've got this lovely craft gin and also craft vermouth movement happening here at the hand of many winemakers. Sebastian Zuccardi's probably the one with the most famous brand today, La Fuerza. And a lot of them have been going out to the mountains and collecting the botanicals from the Andes so that they're not, so that they really are reflecting, the terroir in that sense. Not only a base of local wine, but with the botanical base collected and foraged with native species here. So that's really nice too. I haven't seen many artisanal Fernets yet. I'd say Fernet is more the kind of Coca-Cola of Argentina, and then like the vermouth is more the fine wine spectrum of
Yeah, I don't think something can be artisanal when you're opening up a liter of Coke. Like it
no.
just sounds.
I think anything that you chuck Coke in has already lost it for me. Like I'm not
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm an anti Coca-Cola girl. I do drink tonic though, so I shouldn't pot calling kettle black.
Um, so, how does the production, just going back to some comparisons between Argentina and Chile, how do they differ in production volume?
Well, that can depend on the year. They're actually quite
Sure.
similar in terms of hectares and production. There are some years in which Chile is bigger. There are some years in which Argentina is bigger. Normally, Argentina is just slightly ahead of Chile, but it really has fluctuated and does fluctuate depending on the vintage and also depending on the market. Um, but there's quite a significant difference in culture in that Argentina, still about half the production is consumed within Argentina, whereas the large majority of Chile's production is exported. Um, that's also because of population difference. Chile has a much smaller population, but Argentina has a strong culture. They never lost that culture of drinking a lot of wine, and it's only in recent years that they're kind of losing that culture. Like most other countries around the world, unfortunately, where we're not drinking at lunchtime, we're more kind of moderating our consumption, and that's definitely happening in Argentina too. But Chile kind of switched due to some political pressure, actually, and the culture kind of switched more from wine to less kind of not drinking during the day, no siesta culture. Here in Mendoza, there is still a siesta culture, so people still take a break during the day, which makes drinking wine at lunch, acceptable and easy to do because you're having a nap, you're not
Right.
working.
That's true.
Whereas in Chile, that hasn't been the culture for decades. So the wine drinking culture is a lot less, not as strong in Chile, and there's a lot more consumption of spirits as well, and
Hmm.
pisco, obviously. So those are the kind of big differences, I'd say, in
And
terms
why
of kind of
didn't, if
production and where
Chile,
it
yeah,
goes.
if Chile's such a great exporter, a larger exporter than Argentina as a percentage, why didn't they establish Carmenere as a better calling card, if you will, internationally, as compared to what Argentina did with Malbec?
Well, they only discovered that they had Carmenere in 1994, which is
Ah,
relatively new. So
okay.
they'd already began establishing and you think 1994, 24th of November, 1994, the story of Carmenere is this ampelographer um, came to visit, coincidentally, came to visit a winery called Carmen, and was in the vineyard walking around with a group that was visiting Chile for a conference. And the winemaker at the time, Alvaro Espinosa, who's an excellent winemaker, he was like, can you come and look at my Merlot? Like, there's something different. We call this Merlot Chileno. They didn't call it Merlot like the other Merlot. They called it Merlot Chileno. They thought it was maybe a different clone, or that, something had happened to their Merlot because it would, taste slightly different. Similar kind of ripening cycle, but would taste different. And the leaves would go quite bright, flaming red, whereas Merlot wouldn't do that to the same extent. And the wine, the grapes tasted slightly different. So everyone knew there was a difference between this Merlot, like Bordeaux Merlot, and this Merlot Chileno. And this ampelographer was there in the vineyard, and it was in springtime, and he could see the stamens of the grapevine had this different curly perspective. They kind of like curl around in a very different way to Merlot, and he was like, this is I think this is Carmenere, and everyone was like, you're absolutely nuts. Like, of course it's not this extinct variety from the 1800s in Bordeaux that no one has anymore. It has to be something else. But sure enough, they did the test, and it is Carmenere. Now, some wineries were brave enough in 1994, those in the area, in the vicinity in Maipo, to start bottling as Carmenere. They actually called it Grand Vidur, which is a synonym. Some wineries started bottling in 95, 96 with Carmenere as their grape variety. But it took several years to actually convince most people in the industry that it wasn't their commercially acceptable Merlot that everyone knows in the world, that's easy to sell, that it was Carmenere. It was this totally new variety. That's you imagine going from having a production of something that you can sell easily in the market internationally to suddenly finding out that your vineyard is this rare, weird, crazy variety that no one's heard of. No one knows how to make it because it hasn't been made for hundreds of years. And so it's been a real process. Like, it's a real challenge that Chile's been faced with. And I think it's been very brave, actually, that most of the producers, many of them got rid of it and regrafted with Merlot, but plenty of them kept their Carmenere and kept working with it. Plenty have actually planted Carmenere as a new variety. And it's been a process. It takes time to figure out how to vinify a certain wine, and how long, they'd spent so long treating it as Merlot with the same irrigation, the same viticulture management, picking at the time for Merlot, looking for those Merlot qualities. And so actually figuring out, well, how do we, let's look at this, treat this totally separately to Merlot now, and let's figure out the identity of Carmenere. It's taken time. And I think they're doing a really good job. I think in recent years, we're really starting to see some beautiful Carmeneres coming through. And I think it's much more similar in profile to Cabernet Franc than it is Merlot. So if I were to describe Carmenere to someone who's never tried it before, I would say, think of Cabernet Franc. And then, there are some slight differences. It can be a little bit more kind of pink pepper in Carmenere typically, rather than, what you find in Cabernet Franc. It can have it's got softer tannins, and it's got that slightly kind of softer acidity as well. But I think it's definitely more similar in profile to Cabernet Franc. I don't think it will ever be the flagship. I don't think it will ever be number one in Chile. I think Cabernet Sauvignon is going to remain king in Chile. And I think Chile does an excellent job with Cabernet Sauvignon. So it will always be a niche variety, I think. But, you've got to give Chileans credit, because it was a big risk to take. And it was, it's not easy for them to sell Carmenere even today. No one can say it. It's hard to spell, and you don't have Carmenere in many places in the world, so it's a tough sell.
Viognier and
Garnier
and all those grapes. They should form a club. They need a little help. Let's chat briefly about the other countries mentioned in your book, starting with Uruguay. Maybe just a real top line, because I can't believe how fast the time is flying here. But what's their signature grape, their famous region, a fun fact, if you will?
Yeah.
What would you say about Uruguay?
So Uruguay, the signature grape is Tannat, and again a tough wine that it's only really produced in the kind of Madiran, and I know there's some lots of plantings happening in Texas and different places as well. But Uruguay, really Tannat became the champion because Uruguay has a totally different climate to Chile and Argentina. You've got to think more of Uruguay as somewhere between Galicia and Bordeaux. It's Atlantic, maritime, it's a coastal climate, there's quite high humidity. You never irrigate in Uruguay, whereas here you rely on irrigation. And so you get totally different profile of the wines. And actually, Tanat quite likes a bit of that humidity and gives you a very consistent wine with lots of personality, lots of tannins, lots of acid, plenty of kind of fruit character each year. But then I'd also say the emerging star of Uruguay is their white wines as well, because you have that lovely coastal climate, and in particular Albarino. I think the Albarino from Uruguay can be on par with Galicia, quite easily. Just beautiful, lovely kind of saline, maritime character, but great acidity, nice ripe fruit as well. And then the two main regions to keep your eye on is Canelones, which is the main traditional wine region around the area of Montevideo, with three quarters of the producers based there. And then Maldonado, further towards the coast of Brazil, where you've got a real kind of emergence of new producers, and namely the big producer there is Garçon, they're doing an excellent job with kind of promoting the wines of Uruguay abroad. But Uruguay is fascinating. I love it.
Well, we'll have to read your book to find out more. Is Tanat named for the tannin in it? Like, is that the association?
Yeah, that's the association.
Okay. Right.
It was interestingly in Uruguay it was called Jariague for a very long time, because that was the chap that brought it over with him, the Basque immigrant that brought it over with him in the 1800s as well.
That's much harder to spell and say. So
Yeah, I'm glad they changed it to that.
Absolutely. How about Peru? How would you summarize Peru?
Peru is fascinating because it was the first kind of wine country really of South America, and that's because the viceroyalty was sat there, that's where they were kind of taking over the empire. And so they largely kind of developed this wine industry to support the Spanish who were there. And then they kind of, unfortunately, Peru's history was interrupted because the Spanish got jealous of all the wine production that they were making and the exports that they were doing. So they, prohibited the production of wine, and everyone had to move to Pisco, to Aguardiente, with all their grapevines. So we're only seeing a kind of recent renaissance of Peruvian wine over Pisco production. And there's lots of international varieties like Tanat, there are Malbec, etc. But I'm most excited about those old Criollo varieties, the Pisco varieties, and some of the kind of more artisanal wines that people are making from that, which typically are white varieties and usually more made at a kind of skin contact, nice kind of orange wine style, and some lovely kind of like juicy, easier to drink with that typical salinity that you get in Peru, because most of the wine regions are very close to the coast, sandier soils, so that kind of fruitiness coming through. Very kind of appetizing, easy to drink, simple, kind of unpretentious wines that go really well with the intense Peruvian cuisine, because aside from the kind of ceviche, which everyone knows, most Peruvian cuisine is actually heavily spiced meat dishes. So, having that kind of more fragrant criolla style wine works really nicely.
And Pisco, that's a spirit, right?
Yeah, so Pisco.
Okay.
Yeah, so Pisco is a brandy.
Okay.
Made from the same wine grapes. So you distill the wine grapes. You distill your wine, actually. You make wine and then you distill it into Pisco. And you've got Pisco made in Peru, you've got Pisco made in Chile, and then in Bolivia, they also make their own version of Pisco, but they call it Singani.
Ah, okay. Bolivia then, good segue. What's going on in Bolivia wine-wise?
Well, aside from the Singani, which I do recommend, Bolivia is very interesting. Largely, historically, it develops because of the Potosi mines there, which were, an enormous source of wealth, and also brought lots of Europeans to Bolivia to live there while they were kind of exploiting the mines, or less so working in the mines. And so that's why we had the wine industry really kind of start in that period. And then again, it's more of a recent renaissance that we're starting to see it kind of come back as a wine producing regions rather than Singani or Pisco producing. And I think Tarija is the main area. So that's similar to high altitude Argentina in the north. So very close to Salta, only a few hours driving. and also super high altitude, so quite intense reds, but with nice acidity, quite aromatic whites. But for me, what's most interesting is the Moscatelli Alejandría, which is their main grape variety, which is one of those original ones that came with the Spanish in the 1500s and gave birth to the whole family of Criollo varieties. And they have beautiful wines from Moscatel, dry wines, especially in the region of Sinti. Um, and these Moscatel vines are growing often around peppercorn trees. And so rather than using poles, which we use more commonly today to train vineyards, they would use trees as, the Jesuits would plant trees to train the vineyards. And so they pick up this different flavor because the grapes are growing around peppercorn and other, different tree flavors like chañar. And so they pick up these different flavors. And Moscatel can be quite transparent in showing those lovely flavors. You imagine flowers of Moscatel and peach of Moscatel plus that, pink peppercorn or interesting kind of herbaceous notes. It could be very complex and they're very simple wines again, very unpretentious, but delicious.
That's a fascinating combination. And then Brazil, what are they doing?
Oh, everything. I've just come back from 2 weeks traveling around Brazil.
Ah,
Um, we did 3,600 kilometers in 10 days, which was a
oh
bit
my
nuts, but
goodness. Wow.
but there's so much happening in Brazil. It's really difficult to generalize, but you have the main wine region in the south, Rio Grande do Sul, and that's where the Italian immigrants again came in the 1800s and really, made their mark. But then there was a big change. Everything went to hybrid in the 80s, and we lost a lot of those old kind of Italian varieties. And now, since the kind of 90s and 2000s, there's a switch. Sorry, the hybrids arrived much earlier than the 80s, 50s, 60s. And now there's a switch to fine wines again. So I'd say the thing that Brazil is achieving quite, across the board is their traditional method sparkling wines,
Uh-huh.
which can be very nice. And then you also have a lot of kind of muscatel, like Asti style, kind of touching on that Italian heritage. And then in terms of white and reds, we've got a massive diversity. There's over 300 different varieties, and there's no champion variety. Some people have kind of picked Merlot as the champion variety, but I don't personally agree with that. I actually think there's more potential in some of those interesting Italian varieties like Terroir. Marcelin is also doing quite well. You've got a humid climate, and warm, so you really need to kind of hone in on what works best there. And then there's some very interesting high altitude developments where they've flipped the harvest on its head and prune during the summer when it's wet and warm and humid, and let the vines come to fruition in the winter when it's warm enough and it's sunny and dry, and so you get these winter harvest wines, and some interesting examples of Syrah and Sauvignon Blanc with that.
Oh, wow. Wow, so
But
much to
that's a
discover.
whole other hour-long conversation. Each of these
Yes.
countries could be a different episode.
We should have had a mini series here, but I do want to get to the wines. You have a couple wines there to taste. I'd love to hear about them and what they are. What?
So I picked two that I think kind of represent something interesting happening in different countries. So this is Altos Los Hormigas, who's one of the kind of key producers of Argentina, kind of leading that kind of quality. When I talked about those early pioneers, Attilio Pagli and Alberto Antonini were definitely those pioneers of Malbec. But I'm really enjoying their Blanco at the moment. I haven't opened them because I'm going to drink them tonight. It's to drink it, but I love their Blanco at the moment because this is a really interesting wine, which is a combination of three varieties: Semillon, Pedro Jimenez, and Chenin Blanc. And it's kind of like looking back to the history of Argentine white wine, because Semillon and Chenin Blanc used to be two of the most planted varieties here in Argentina. And I love the Semillon, the old vine Semillon that you get from Argentina and Chile. And I really recommend trying some of those. But then it's also got Pedro Jimenez, which is actually our most planted white grape variety in Argentina. And it's a native Criollo variety. It's not related to the Spanish Pedro Jimenez. And I'm really interested in the kind of movement to try and bring that back. There's a couple producers, Mariana Nofri is another one, who does a great job in trying to show the potential of Pedro Jimenez. It's a simple grape variety, but it adds like a nice kind of simplicity, and sometimes you need some Pedro Jimenez in your life to kind of balance out the bigger, more expressive grape varieties. And this is delicious. It's a very austere style of white wine. It's one of my favorites and go-tos. It's about 11% ABV. It is 11% ABV. So that's always, nice when you want to have a few glasses in the evening and not think too much about a headache in the morning. And it's just got great acidity and real fruit purity and just feels like a very mountain white wine, which I think is exciting in Argentina today, are these mountain white wines. Not chasing that same kind of new world, like big fruit that we get from like New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, but very much kind of going for, for austerity, for purity, for minerality, and more about texture than about aroma, which I really enjoy.
That's awesome. Did you have a second wine there that you wanted
I
to
do,
share?
yeah.
Yes.
So
Okay.
this is one of my favorite projects in Chile, Viñedos de Alcohuas, and this is an incredible vineyard right in the Elqui Valley. It's the highest kind of altitude commercial vineyard in Chile, 2,200 meters above sea level, and tucked into the mountains. Absolutely nuts to go visit. And I first went in this is a special vintage. I first went in 2014 and met one of my kind of best friends today, who's the winemaker there at the time, Emily Faulkner. And she was working, the founder here is Marcelo Retamal, who for me is hands down one of the best winemakers of Chile. And it's this beautiful project that they've completely, planted these new vines in a virgin territory and are really battling with altitude. It's very intense and hot in the day. You're surrounded by bare rocks. It's incredible. I can upload some photos for you to see. But you've got this really cool night. So you get these beautiful structured wines. So in this case, it's a blend with Syrah, Garnacha, and Petit Syrah. And it's just a very meaty, intense wine with incredible Syrah character, but beautiful acidity and super age-worthy wines that you should hold for several years. And Marcelo Retamal always releases them with several years of aging, which I think is great. And the coolest thing about the vineyard is that it's all kind of built into the rocks. Sorry, the winery, it's built into the rocks. It's all kind of with the native rocks from the area. And all of the vines are trodden by foot. So that was my first experience, like properly foot treading, was there in Alcohuas. And, it's a very kind of natural wine production, but just stellar wines as well.
Oh, wow. We'll link to those in the show notes. So yes, I cannot believe how time has flown. Do you have a most useful wine gadget that you've come across as we start to wrap up here?
I don't. I mean, for me, the most important thing. Oh, I love I don't know if I could go get it, but like one of those ice bags where you've got the plastic bag that you could pop your bottle in,
Oh,
and you
okay.
fill it with ice, and it's just a great kind of carrier that you can like literally take your ice. Because I often take wines to restaurants to
Yes.
uncork there, and so I always go with my little plastic bag, which is filled with ice. I'm so sorry, it's over there. I can get it very
No,
quickly.
that's okay. That's all right.
But it's that lovely ice bag that, your personalized
Yep.
ice bag where you can keep it cool and then just pop it open when you get there.
I need to get one of
Simple, but it
those.
does the
Yes,
job. And it
absolutely.
keeps it cool while you're traveling, so it's perfect.
Yeah. Oh, we'll put a link to that also in the show notes. Now, as we wrap up, Amanda, it's been fabulous. Is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to mention?
No, just drink more South American wine. You've got such great value. Like
Sure.
just, drink more South American wine and let me know as well. I love to know what people are drinking and what they're enjoying. And, I just think there's a world to discover here and it's always such great value. And start drinking it now before it's too late, because at some point people are going to wake up and these wines are going to be quite expensive. So
It's
before
true.
it's too late, drink it now.
Yes. You heard it here first. Where can people find your book and find you online, Amanda?
So in Canada, you want to have a look at Academy de Vin. They're the distributor, and then also all my ebooks and everything are available on my website, South America Wine Guide. And that's where you can find me as well. So southamericawineguide.com. That's my alias on Instagram too. I'm Amanda Barnes. You can find me in YouTube, lots of different places as well. But I'm quite accessible on Instagram. Haven't really got
Excellent.
into X or Twitter as much as
You're not missing much.
no. Okay, good. Glad to hear.
Yeah. And we'll link to your website and your Instagram and so on, and Academy de Vin on the show notes. So I am going to say goodbye, but don't log off or hang up just yet, Amanda, because we'll make sure that all of this is uploaded. But thank you so much for being with us here and for your time, and congratulations on the South American Wine Guide. It's excellent.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to chat with you, Natalie. I look
All
forward to
right.
seeing you in Canada one day soon.
Absolutely. That'd be great. Thank you.